Welcome aboard the Evolution Eisenbahn, the train of life, where we go on guided tours through the tree of life to learn about biology and evolution. I am Sebastian and I am your tour guide. As always, we will start the tour here at Lucas Station. And today's tour will be a bit of a longer one. We will cover the whole story of the evolution of the plants. You will learn how they were invented, why they were such a success story, and why plants are the way they are. Departure is now imminent, so may I remind you of our special offer, a nice steaming bowl of primordial soup, now available in the dining car. As always, free of charge. Get it now while it's still fresh. And we have departed. And you noticed we left the station towards the east today. This means we are now on the track of the eukaryotes, the third domain of life. All but 2 train stations on this map are dedicated to the eukaryotes. From our perspective, the invention of the eukaryote is maybe the single most important event in all of evolutionary history. Consider this: before the eukaryotes were invented, there were only bacteria and archaea, so that is, microscopic single-celled organisms. And that was the case for 2 billion years. That's half of life's entire history. And maybe life would still be microbes only if, one fateful day, the eukaryote hadn't been invented. And who knows how likely this event was? It sure took long enough to happen. Might as well never have happened. Seems like we are pretty lucky. So, how was the eukaryote invented? In a nutshell, one historic day, an archaeon and a bacterium combined and formed a new organism. We call this extraordinary milestone event symbiogenesis. By symbiosis of 2 organisms, a new life form was created. That was the ancestor of all eukaryotes. And why was it so special? Well, because it combined some of the best abilities of the archaea with some of the best abilities of the bacteria. For example, the archaeon could change its shape. We are a cell skeleton, and the bacterium was extremely efficient at turning food into energy. Together, they formed a more complex cell, and over the eons, the bacteria turned into so-called mitochondria. You may have heard that before. We also call them the powerhouses of the cell. And yes, since you are a eukaryote, that in fact means that the descendants of this first symbiotic bacterium provide the power for all of your cells to this day. All right, back to our tour. So now that the eukaryote has been invented, the floodgates are open for endless forms most beautiful. And now we're coming up to our first branching point. So now the newly created eukaryote line splits into 2 groups. What did they split into? They split into unicons and bicons. What are they? Well, both are single-celled eukaryotes. Just one has 1 flagellum and the other has 2 flagella. Now you're a bit disappointed, right? That doesn't sound like an exciting difference. And I probably wouldn't talk about this split much at all if it wasn't for the fact that the bicons, and I think this is by pure chance, the bicons happen to be the ancestor of all plants, and the unicons happen to be the ancestor of everything else, so all fungi and animals. So yeah, even though these 2 groups are very similar initially, this split is very important. Okay, and since we are headed to the plants, we will follow the northbound track. Now we're on the bicon track towards the plants. But the bicons here are not plants yet. They are single-celled eukaryotes that happen to have 2 flagella, not that special. But now our first stop is coming up. Some species with these ancient characteristics, so that is, they are single-celled eukaryotes with 2 flagella, some of these have survived until today. Next stop, Excavada. Welcome to the Excavada. As I said, they are single-celled eukaryotes. And even though I just pointed out that these early eukaryotes were not that special yet, the Excavada are actually pretty weird. Maybe that's because only the weird ones have survived until today, those that found their special niche. For example, many of them are parasites, even human parasites. Maybe you've heard of Giardia, Trichomonas, or trypanosomes. I used to do research with trypanosomes, and they are astounding. They swim openly in your blood when you're infected, and they fight the immune system head-on instead of hiding in your cells like pretty much all other parasites. So yeah, they're pretty badass. And if you have them, they cause the so-called sleeping sickness. Now, I could tell you stories about the excavata for hours, but they're not our focus today, so let's move on. Maybe they'll get their own tour one day. Look! The track has changed color and turned green. We have reached another major milestone of evolution. This is arguably the second most important event after the invention of the eukaryote. This event resulted in a new super being that was bound to conquer the whole world. This time, a bicont eukaryote combined with a different bacterium, a so-called cyanobacterium, that was capable of photosynthesis, that is, it could make sugar out of sunlight. And they formed a symbiotic relationship, another symbiogenesis event. Over time, the cyanobacteria turned into so-called chloroplasts, and now we have a new being that can not only metabolize energy extremely efficiently via mitochondria, it can also produce its own energy from sunlight via chloroplasts. And thus, the plant was invented. So now we finally reached the plants. But so far they're only single-celled algae. The next big step was to become multicellular. Or you could also say the next step was the invention of death. With the invention of the body, death was invented at the same time. Single-celled organisms reproduce by dividing, by making exact copies of themselves. And that means that they are in the evolutionary sense immortal, because no information is ever lost. But the body is unique, one of a kind, and thus it can die. Nothing quite like it will ever exist again, and that is true death. Apparently it's worth the cost. There's much more to this story of why death was invented and how. I mean, cells giving up replication even though their genes are completely selfish? Why would the genes give up replicating themselves? It's paradoxical. It seems to go against the laws of evolution. It's a story I'd love to tell one day, but not today.
Next stop, Rhodophyceae.
Now, after all these new inventions, we finally reached our next stop, the Rhodophyceae, the red algae. Now finally, that looks like a real plant. Well, at least like a real alga. And they are the first and oldest plant group on our map. But why are they red? Well, water absorbs light to different degrees based on the wavelength, that is, the color of the light. And red light doesn't make it very far into the ocean. And so the red algae don't bother to absorb it because they usually don't get any red light anyway. And since they don't absorb it, it gets reflected back. And so when they're out of the water, they appear red because that's the light that reaches our eyes. They still have an older model of the chloroplast, one that is better at absorbing green and bluish light, which makes it deeper into the ocean. And that is probably the reason why the red algae are still a successful group to this day, because they can thrive in deeper water, unlike the plants at our next stop.
Next stop, Chlorophyta.
Now we have reached the Chlorophyta, the green algae. Their invention was the chloroplast in the strict sense, so that is the green chloroplast, the one that you probably thought of. It is more efficient, but that comes with a price. This new chloroplast is particularly good at absorbing red light. But as I said, red light is absorbed by water, so the Chlorophyta limited themselves to the water surface. But with that came also a tremendous opportunity. The green algae were the ones that conquered dry land, where there's not only minerals, but also lots of direct sunshine, which they could use much more efficiently than the red algae. However, getting out of the ocean wasn't that easy. Algae are almost entirely made of water after all. It took a long time and many smart inventions. In fact, you will see that this quest of becoming more and more independent of water is pretty much the story of the remainder of our tour today. So let's now make the jump from ocean to dry land. And one invention that made this possible was the embryo. Yes, plants have embryos too. Well, land plants at least. And that's the reason why all land plants are called embryophyta, embryo plants, because embryos are what they all have in common. So how did having an embryo help with getting out of the ocean? Well, algae just release eggs and sperm into the water when they reproduce. Yes, algae also have eggs and sperm. Plants and animals come from a common ancestor after all and weren't that different yet. But on land, you can't just release your eggs. They'd dry up immediately. Instead, you keep the eggs close, let them develop into embryos, and take care of them. And animals later came up with the same strategy.
Next stop, Bryophyta.
The oldest land plant group on our map is the Bryophyta, the mosses. They are just kind of one step out of the ocean, and it shows. They are kind of like green algae that have learned to tolerate being out of the water. Well, at least for a little bit, because as you know, mosses can only grow in moist places, so they're still pretty reliant on water. And they also still kind of look like green algae, because they have no true leaves, no roots, no vasculature, so they dry up pretty quickly. But the biggest reason why they can only grow in humid places is actually this. They still have sperm. Yes, that's right, they still have swimming sperm cells. So it really is the case that sperm from the male plant has to swim to the female plant for sexual reproduction. And of course that only works if there's like a water film between them for the sperm to swim in. And after fertilization, an embryo grows on the mother plant and is nurtured there. And it matures and eventually releases spores. Then the spores get dispersed by the wind, and then new moss plants grow from the spores. So yeah, that is how mosses manage to reproduce on land. And fun fact on the side, their sperm cells look like Chinese dragons. Let me tell you, despite humble appearances, I think mosses are actually really cool.
Next stop, Polypodiopsida.
Next we have two new inventions, vasculature and specialized tissues, that is, roots and leaves. And the oldest group on our map with those characteristics are the Polypodiopsida, the ferns. So with their roots, they can draw water out of the ground and with their vascular system can transport it up to the leaves. That's much better water management than the mosses have. And that made ferns extremely successful. You've probably seen illustrations from the age of the dinosaurs, when we had huge fern forests on this planet. So now ferns could grow extremely tall and spread all over the place. And today we pick them up as coal. However, all fern forests were humid forests, kind of like tropical rainforests nowadays. That is because they are still pretty dependent on water. And why is that? Well, because they still have sperm. So they too need water films for the sperm to swim from one plant to the next. Plus, ferns don't have seeds yet. Just like mosses, they produce only spores. Maybe you've seen that. On the underside of fern leaves there are these spots, and this is where the spores are released. And the spores are dispersed by the wind, and they are tiny, so they need to fall on moist soil to germinate. So even though with their new characteristics, the ferns could grow much taller than mosses, they still rely on humid soil for reproduction. So the next goal is clear, right? We finally need to get rid of the sperm. And that's exactly what's coming next.
Next stop, Gymnospermae.
We enter the realm of the spermatophytes, the seed plants. And the oldest seed plant group is the gymnosperms. Most well known among those are the conifers, like pines and spruces and firs, all these trees with needles. But also the ginkgo tree is a gymnosperm, and also some others. They have pollen, and finally got rid of the swimming sperm cells. Well, mostly. Ginkgo actually still has swimming sperm, but they only need to swim a very short distance when they're already on the tree. But what all gymnosperms have in common though is that they pack their embryos into seeds to protect them. And that works really well. As you know, some seeds can survive for years. Their seeds are naked though. Gymnosperm means naked seed. Imagine a pine cone When that opens, the seeds just fall out because they're naked in there. Contrast that, for example, with an apple where the seeds are encased in a fruit. And that leads me to the last milestone invention of this tour: enclosed seeds and flowers. They go hand in hand because they're both adaptations towards even more independence. Gymnosperms rely mostly on the wind for reproduction, right? The pollen of a pine is carried by the wind. But this new group, the angiosperms, the plants with enclosed seeds, they decided to rely mostly on animals. Animals eventually had followed the plants on dry land, and by now they are everywhere as well. And even though animals have agendas of their own, they can be influenced and manipulated. Whereas, unless you know the name of the wind, it's really hard to control the wind. So the plants invented flowers to attract animals as pollinators and encase their seeds into fruits to give the animals incentive to spread around those seeds.
Next stop, Magnoliidae.
There are three major groups of flowering plants, the oldest of which are the Magnoliidae. They take their name from the magnolias which belong to this group, and other members include avocado and laurel and peppers and the cinnamon tree. So even though this group is the oldest among the flowering plants and doesn't have as many species nowadays, some of its members are quite prominent. They already have real flowers, right? They are flowering plants after all, but you can still tell that they are closest to the gymnosperms. Check out the flower of a magnolia. It looks like a pine cone with petals around it, so it's still a pretty basic design.
Next stop, Liliopsida.
Then there are the Liliopsida, the lily plants, aka monocots. Monocots because they only have a single so-called cotyledon. Cotyledons are the first leaves the seed will develop when it sprouts. And as I said, the monocots have only one of these baby leaves. So that is plants like lilies, obviously, but also all grains and grasses, corn, bamboo, palms, bananas, orchids, pineapples, onions, and so many more. So you see, it's a very successful group. And even though they can look very different from each other, they do have some typical common traits. So I already mentioned the single cotyledon, the single baby leaf, but another thing is that their leaf veins run parallel. Look at a blade of grass or corn or any monocot. You will see that the leaf veins run parallel. And ever since I learned that, I love running around identifying the Liliopsida when I'm outside. And another typical monocot trait is that they show no secondary growth. That means once part of a plant is fully formed, it never grows again. Palms and bamboo, they only grow taller, but not thicker. A tree grows in thickness every year and forms these tree rings. But monocots gave up this trait, probably in exchange for being able to grow faster.
Next stop, Eudicotyledonae.
And speaking of trees, with that, we reach our final destination, the Eudicotyledonae, the true dicot plants. Dicots, in contrast to monocots, always have two cotyledons, two baby leaves when sprouting. And the dicots have by far the most plant species. Pretty much anything that's not a grass or a palm or something is a dicot. So, for example, sunflowers, lemon trees, Venus flytraps, cactuses, coffee, willow trees, spinach, dandelion, all the plants. By the sheer diversity of this group, you can tell that it's a very successful one. And of course, they are everywhere. I mean, in the case of the cactuses, they even grow in the desert, so they have reached peak water independence. Okay, this is it. We are at the end of today's tour. A tour that led us from Lucca through two symbiogenesis events and then followed the plants on their quest to leave the ocean and spread all over the planet. Do you remember what I said earlier when we discussed the invention of the chloroplast? I told you that the being that came from this event would conquer the whole world. That's exactly what happened. Today, pretty much all multicellular life forms that produce their own energy are the descendants of this super being, and we call them plants. Just try to imagine what the world would look like if this event had never happened. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section. And join us next time on another tour on the train of life. Thank you for choosing Evolution Eisenbahn. Take care and goodbye.